is obviously Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine 636 days ago, which completely changed the West's defense posture. What had been a fairly languid effort to increase defense spending, strongly pressed by the US, went into overdrive when European countries and the NATO alliance saw that they were woefully unprepared for an aggressive and revanchist Russia prepared to use military force to upend the global order. The war in Ukraine has shown that much of the equipment, plans, budgets, and supplies prepared by Western militaries and defense ministries weren't suited to the type of conflict that we're now seeing across hundreds of kilometers of front line in Ukraine. Governments have since been racing to boost defense spending. Poland is now the #1 spender in NATO with almost 4% of GDP going on the military. That's followed closely by other frontline states. Even southern European countries, which have been traditionally wary of defense spending, are upping their budgets. It now turns out that militaries are investing much too little in traditional weapons like tanks and artillery systems, and also need to ramp up research into areas like drone warfare. Those shortfalls are causing real problems. As we've reported, the EU pledge to send 1 million shells to Ukraine by March will almost certainly not be met. The new situation is throwing up a host of questions. Is there a need for long-term defense contracts to give defense companies certainty? Is Europe's defense industry too fragmented? Should countries set up more pan-national research and procurement projects? What role should the EU play in beefing up the bloc's defense capabilities? Can Ukraine be reliably supplied by existing capacity, or should the West help Kiev build up its own military-industrial complex to make it less reliant on the whims of its allies? And finally, how a more military-prepared Europe should interact with traditional allies in the US and countries like South Korea and Israel. Today, we'll start with a conversation with the CEOs of two of Europe's leading defense companies, Airbus and Saab, and then we'll talk policy on a panel with senior defense and foreign policy officials. But first things first, we have some housekeeping remarks. I'd like to thank our partner ASD for making this event possible, and to thank our fantastic Politico Live team who've made it all come together. We'd like to make this event as interactive as possible, and you can participate by tweeting about it at @LivePolitico, and you can also ask questions through Slido using hashtag PoliticoProDefense. I'd only ask if you do so if you can identify your name and your organization so the questions are fully transparent for our viewers and our panelists. You can already share your thoughts and answer the following poll, which is presented by our partner ASD. And the question is, what do you consider the top priority for adapting the European defense industry to the new security environment? Please rank the given options, and we'll look at the results when we wrap up the session. Now I'd like to welcome our two guests to the interview panel. Joining us remotely is Guillaume Faury, the Chief Executive Officer of Airbus and President of ASD. And here on stage is Mikael Johansson, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Saab, as well as the Vice Chairman of the Board of ASD. Mikael. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
First, I'd like to ask both of you, and Mikael, since you're sitting here with me, what is your assessment of how your company is dealing with the very changed security environment that we've seen over the last year and a half?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, I usually say I've been with the company for 38 years. So what I've seen in the last 2 years is something completely different. It's a paradigm shift. Having to increase capacity is much about here and now, and how we quickly can increase capacity from the sites we have. And specifically, it's been so conventional, the support to Ukraine from many countries, so to replenish stock when it comes to ammunition, even though we don't do artillery ammunition, we do 84mm support weapons, but that's also a huge demand. And fortunately, we took sort of a bold decision a year before the tragic war in Ukraine started to invest heavily in production capacities. So I guess end next year, early 25, we have quadrupled the output of support weapons and ammunition from our facility. So just to give you a feeling for the context and quantity, it's like going from 100,000 a year to more than 400,000 units output from one facility in Sweden. And then again, investing in redundancy. We can't have everything in the same place. We need to invest elsewhere in Europe and maybe in the US. So investment decisions and trying to understand where we're going, it's been a sort of such a journey, and it's such a growth. So completely different than what I've seen before.
Great, thanks. Guillaume, if you could address the same question, and you're taking a more hands-on approach with Airbus, keeping a close watch on the defense side of the company. And how has the last year and a half changed Airbus?
It has put defense obviously much more at the center of what we do, of the priorities of the management, and the time that we spend with political leaders, with defense procurement agencies, and on the programs we're engaged. I think it has increased speed, it has increased the need for agility, and for able to understand what is going to happen and how we should adapt to it. So a lot of work, a lot of focus, a lot of attention. We are not providing ammunition, so we have not done what Michael has explained before as Airbus, but we can see that defense is much more a matter of discussion than it was before. But there are many things that need to be taken care of. Obviously, it's the ability to fund, it's the ability to contribute to finding the scale for large projects that require significant investment, and also a lot of technology, skills, talented people. So maybe also spending time to try to bundle and organize the cooperations that are required to have an impact at scale in an environment where the battlefields are much more numerous than they were before, much more complex, and where the need for investment is actually 360 degrees.
In our report done so far, we've heard a very strong feedback from industry that there is a real need for long-term contracts. Maybe both of you could address this, starting with Michael. Why is that? Is there a sense that governments are hedging and hoping that you guys put the money up, invest yourself, and not have the commitment of long-term contracts? And what problems does that cause for industry without that long-term certainty?
No, but definitely. I mean, one of the biggest challenges I see today is that we don't really know where we're going. Even though we're growing dramatically and investing both in here and now, as I mentioned, but also in future capabilities, what's the objective? Where is the target? Where do we have to go? Because this is a paradigm shift. It's one thing to go from a peace perspective of things in many countries in Europe, and then all of a sudden saying we need much more resilience, deterrence, and we need to be able to manage a conflict and be prepared to get into conflict. Then you have to have capacity, and you have to have stocks, and you have to pay for it somehow. Either you sort of have overcapacity in times where the need is not that high and someone has to pay for that, or in combination with much bigger stocks of things. And there must be a risk-sharing model here between states and industry. Today we are taking steps in the right directions, but we don't see enough of long-term contracts or commitments or the model, for that sake, on how to handle this going forward. So definitely there is it's a new future in how we view this going forward. It's not sort of you can't have the cake and eat it at the same time. There has to be paid for.
Thanks. Guillaume, are you finding the same thing, that there's an issue with the expectation on the part of governments that they want companies to step up, start boosting production rapidly, but are not providing the certainty that business wants from the government side?
I think there are two dimensions to the question. One is linked to the development of new capabilities, and we are in an industry, the defense industry, where the systems are very complex ones. They require long-term developments, demonstration of the capability, certification, and you can't change the course of action. in the middle of those programs, or you just waste all the investment you've done before. Then you have the production side, and on the production, we are on programs that have been designed, that have been launched in peacetime, and now we are trying to access to an agility, an ability to ramp up production, to produce more on short notice, that is completely different from what was structured years ago. And we can't be doing this across the board on all systems now, on the short term. So we need priorities. We need to understand what needs to be done now, what are the other priorities for which we could enjoy more time. And that's something that needs to be done in consultation with the main interested parties to come to conclusions and then be able to define those priorities. At the moment, we see a lot of scenario assessment, and it's a bit chaotic. It's chaotic in time, and it's chaotic in space, I may say, because the alignment between nations is, in my view, difficult to obtain. Therefore, we have this fragmentation in space, fragmentation in time, that is not consistent with heavy investment on the long run. And that's why we are having those discussions on the need for more long-term perspectives and trying to be strategic at the time where we have a lot of things playing out on the short term and giving the feeling that we're becoming super tactical. In military and defense programs, these are long-term programs, they are at the big scale, and we need that stability to be able to deliver something that is worth, that has a value for the defense customers.
When you say you're looking for that stability, are you looking for national capitals to take the lead, or the European Union, which is playing a larger role than in the past in defense policy, or NATO? Or who should be stepping up to guide this process?
Depends. When we have multinational programs, we need the partners of the program to come to agreement together. And when we're speaking about national programs, that's obviously much easier to get a guidance. At least there are less stakeholders, it can change over time, but at least there are less interested parties. We have few programs which are European programs as such. Most of the programs or the projects are multinational or national, and we need at least those partners, those stakeholders, to agree and stabilize something that can pave the way for performance over time.
Great. Mikhail, the EU, as I mentioned, is playing a bigger role. What's your ask? What do you want out of Brussels when it comes to the sort of growing heft that it has in the defense space?
Well, I think the EU initiatives that we see today are actually quite good. I think the European Defence Fund is a good start of things, looking at future capabilities that creates incentives for countries and industry to work together for new capabilities. And that needs to be expanded and sort of taking the news, EDF 2.0 or something in the next MFF, the big financial scale. So we need to put more money into that. Then there are other initiatives that are also good, but not enough money spent on it today, and that's sort of the ASAP, the production capacity sort of support, and some of the common procurement initiatives, the DIRPA. We still need to see what are the next steps in terms of co-development, if there is an incentive or initiative launched by the Commission called EDIP or something after the European Defence Industry Strategy is in place. However, all what we're doing here is good initiatives, but it has to be aligned with a strategic direction. And there is some sort of, in my head, still a misalignment between what EU is doing, at least as an industry, I don't really understand it, and where NATO is going. The only organization I see with the defense planning process and with strategic objective and regional defense objectives is NATO. So we have to understand what the member states and what the EU initiatives are trying to do in terms of initiatives for new capabilities are supporting that direction. So I'd like EU and NATO to be a little bit closer in when it comes to explaining the calls that we see from these initiatives are actually supporting the NATO direction of defense planning. So a little bit more of that I would like to see.
Is the EU involvement adding confusion to that, or is it a useful extra voice to have in the defense debate?
I think it's useful, and it's good that these initiatives are now being launched. But to make it really strategic in the right direction, there's more to do, I think. And we haven't seen the full scale of it yet in terms of common acquisition programs and who is going to do the acquisition. Is it the Commission? Is it the EDA? Is it OCCAR? It is NSPA? Or is it the different member states? That's still a bit uncertain from an industry perspective.
Thanks. Guillaume, what's your view on that, on the role that the EU is playing and sort of the interaction between national governments, the EU and NATO, and trying to sort of set a policy for this changed environment?
Thanks for asking the question, and I think it's a very central one for success or failure of defense in Europe. I think the EU and the member states have recognized that we need to join forces, that the investment and the cost involved in putting together the capabilities are very significant. For each system, the non-recurring costs, as we call them, are super high. And if you multiply those investments on competitive systems, diversity in Europe, then you don't gain the scale and you don't gain the efficiency that is required because of the multiple systems that are needed in a modern defense organization. So we need to work together. We need to find an ability to bundle investment and therefore have European programs, projects, a smaller number of more efficient capabilities. The EU is trying to create the frame for that better cooperation, for that better ability to have member states working together. And we've seen the many tools, devices, EDF was mentioned before, we have the EDIRPA as well, and many others that you know. I think the intentions are the good ones. The objective to create that collaboration, that common procurement or common development of systems is right, but it's today quite complex, and we have not yet seen the full efficiency, the full power of those systems, of those tools that are provided by the EU at play. And so it's a very important start. I think the direction that is given is the right one, but we need to keep working on the details, on the way it works to get the full power that is behind this intention. And bottom line, at the end, we really need the member states to come together to share views and agree on what they need, the capabilities, so we can then organize industrial players working together to serve those capabilities. If we don't have common needs, it's very difficult to offer common solutions.
You mentioned super high costs. There's sort of rival jet fighter development programs, FCAS and GCAP, one of which Airbus is involved in. Some of these programs have been marked by national tensions, often between Paris and Berlin. How useful do you think these models are in this changed security environment to develop long-term weapons platforms, enormously expensive projects?
Well, the air and space power, the protection of the airspace above Europe will only be managed in an integrated way. We will have systems working in the air and space that have to be connected. This has to be cyber secured, and this is a very complex project. Obviously, this will not happen without cooperation between member states. At Airbus, we are very happy to be part of the FCAS. I think that's a successful program in terms of bringing Germany, France, and Spain together. We would never be able to achieve the goals of FCAS if it would be on a national basis. Of course, each and every country has some specific objectives in those programs. So, as I said before, we need to make sure that there are common objectives and common requirements. That's one thing. And the other one, each and every member state that contributes, that participates into those programs, wants to make sure that its own industrial players will have a good place in that cooperation. And obviously, when we start those programs, there are tensions. When we look at the FCAS, it's a great success. Yes, there was in the press a bit of the reflection of the tensions between Airbus and Dassault for the fighter, but the FCAS is much more than the next generation fighter. It's a combat cloud, it's remote carriers, it's engines, it's sensors and the architecture. And on the overall program, it's been a very, very good way of structuring the work and coming to an agreement for what we call the phase 1B, which is the technological phase. So I think, basically, given the complexity and the magnitude of that program, bottom line, it's been a very successful journey so far.
Mikhail, Sweden was in the rival global combat air program, pulled out, I think, was this summer. What's your assessment of the fact that in Europe you've got two rival projects to develop next generation fighters? Is that a good idea, or should there be some consolidation to have only a single one?
I don't see it as a problem that we have two sort of collaboration programs. And when it comes to Sweden, I mean, it's all about when do you need the next generation capability and how do you approach the systems of systems, as Guillaume was mentioning. And I think Sweden has just taken a step back to look upon the fact that we will have a fighter aircraft that will be in operations until beyond 2050. And how do we go about now either collaborating with like-minded countries or maybe trying to join one of these consortiums in the end, or without sort of losing what I call the OEM capability? Because we have to recognize that it's a big thing for a country to say, for France and for Sweden, to say that we don't need sovereign capability to build fighters or to do systems integration on a fighter level. That's a really important thing. If we can find a partnership doing that at the same time, but retaining that capability, I think it's a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing that we're competing right now, trying to look at next generation. What will happen over time, I don't really know. We will definitely, as a country and as a company, have the objective of retaining this OEM capability, because that will add to Europe's defense capabilities and it will add to NATO's defense capabilities. I don't see it as a problem that we're not completely aligned when it comes to certain capabilities. We can't have too many, of course, but it's good to have competition, and that drives innovation, it drives edge. So even if you talk about fighters or airborne early warning or main battle tanks or missile systems, I think there needs to be competition to have the best. And I don't see the fragmentation as a big problem today in Europe, actually.
So you mentioned retaining OEM capability. How does that square up with what many countries are facing, which is a pressure to immediately upgrade and modernize their equipment and to buy off the shelf, often from the States? A lot of countries are buying F-35s. The Poles are an example of a country which went on a bit of a shopping spree, buying Abrams tanks from the States, stocking up on huge amounts with weapons contracts from South Korea. How does that, what impact does that have on the European defense industry, that pressure?
Well, it says something about sort of in what shape we are when it comes to the capacity of the overall defense industries in Europe. We have great defense industries in Europe, but we have been in a peacetime environment. We have been sort of sustaining our capabilities because of export also outside the EU. But we have to step up because, of course, I don't see it as we have to take more responsibility. We have to do more in Europe, in EU, when it comes to our capabilities. Working together, but we can't have it being too dependent on the US as we are right now. it is a shame that we have 70% of the defense spending into European defense capabilities coming from the US. That dependency is not sound going forward. That balance is wrong. It should be the opposite. We should be having a sovereign capability in competition, of course, but in Europe of 70%, I say, sort of rough numbers. But the transatlantic link is important, but the balance is wrong today. So I see it as a big problem if all the money from all the member states just is flowing out to be supporting acquisitions from other countries outside the EU. That is not a good development.
Guillaume, could I get you to address the same issue? F-35s, other programs, should European countries focus more of their spending on European companies, or do you simply need to ramp up acquisition and it doesn't matter quite so much where it comes from?
I completely agree with what Mikael said before. We need a certain European preference to get to the scale. I mean, maybe the 70% is the right objective, or maybe an 80-20 is something that would make sense as well. To be powerful, we need a certain degree of sovereignty. If you're completely in the hands of someone else, even if it's a strong ally, then actually you're much weaker than what you think, and that's basically what Mikael was addressing before. To gain scale and power, we need to cooperate, so to join forces and being able to invest much more than we do today on a given weapon system or equipment. And to gain scale, we need also to be able to export what the US is doing very well. They have their own market, and on top, they access to other markets, increasing the scale of what they do. And actually, that's to the detriment of Europe today. So our very important partner in NATO, that is US, is also in that sense making us weaker today in our own ability to develop systems, to equip ourselves. So that's this rebalancing that we need to structure, especially at a time when US is maybe less looking to the Atlantic side of the country and more looking to the Pacific side. It says a lot, in my view, on how much we have to take our own future in our hands. And therefore, it's probably more important than ever to be able to be strong Europeans in defense. And that's why I'm here to speak with you today. It's to contribute to that debate and making sure that we move forward in the right direction with the right power.
It's pressing, especially pressing issue for Airbus. You've been pressing the German government to release its block on selling Eurofighters to Saudi Arabia. Has there been any progress on that? Do you think that that's the position of Berlin is changing?
I think there is more understanding in Berlin of why we're making that point and why we're making the point so strongly. It's not only Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabian case is for the Eurofighter, and Eurofighter we have as well Turkey, that is a NATO member, and actually the attitude of Berlin on restricting exports when it comes to defense is really something that, in my view, has very negative potential long-term consequences. So yes, I see a change in Berlin. I see a much better understanding of the ripple effects and the impact, the negative impact that this would have for Germany, for defense in Germany, and on a broader scale for European cooperations. And I'm very hopeful that this will further evolve and that we would reach a better point. That's really important in my view at this point of history.
EU officials have raised the suggestion that perhaps exports, especially of ammunition, should be curtailed in order to supply Ukraine. Should there be an overview of exports, and with the main focus being of sending ammunition and equipment to Ukraine?
Well, that's a very political question, and it belongs to the political leaders to try to arbitrate between different needs. I think the role of industry is trying to provide solutions so that the decisions are easier to make, and there is less left or right, but probably what I would call the cheese and dessert solution that would provide, decent answers to different needs. Obviously, we need time, we need investment, so that's where the need for deep understanding, deep discussion and alignment at the end comes together.
Mikhail, there's been a lot of talk about a need for sort of transnational projects to develop these new systems. Do you think that the European defense industry is too fragmented? Should there be a consolidation? Or is it about right? I've seen some assessments that the Americans, looking at their defense industry, think that consolidation there went a little bit too far, is producing higher costs and less innovation than they'd like because of that structure.
No, I've seen that as well, and as I said earlier, I think, generally speaking, I don't see that we are too fragmented. There might be certain capabilities, certain areas where maybe we're too fragmented, but I think we can do more in terms of collaborating, because this is not only about us as primes, this is about the whole ecosystem, the whole supply chain, and there is a huge amount of smaller companies supporting what we're trying to do, and we can maybe optimize that a bit further to make sure that we're not sort of saturating the whole ecosystem now in the growth phase we're in. We can do more there, but I don't see the European defense industry as, generically speaking, as too fragmented, and competition will lead to, and long-term contracts will lead to sort of the consolidation we need, I think, if member states start thinking about collaborating. It all starts with the user requirements, as Guillaume was alluding to earlier. If countries come together buying the same things, it will drive consolidation.
Thanks. I mentioned a little bit in the intro that there's a sense that some of the priorities, the way that the defense industry was structured, what countries were buying, was not exactly suited for the 21st century war that we're seeing in Ukraine. What's the top lesson or lessons that you've drawn from the way that the war has developed in Ukraine?
Well, as everyone else, I mean, it's a mix of really conventional war in terms of we never expected that type of war with that huge amount of ammunition needed. And we're not there yet in Europe to even be close to, if this war continues, hopefully not, the amount of ammunition needed on a yearly basis is sort of much higher than the capacity of production today. So that's one sort of takeaway, that we need to have more deterrence, more resilience, bigger stockpiles, be prepared. The other thing is that how quickly you can embrace sort of technologies and embrace those and implement them in a much more quick way if you have the incentive of using things quickly. I'm not saying that sort of takes away all what Guillaume said about certification and making sure that things are reliable and all that, but I think us as primes have to sort of, I think we're doing that right now. How quickly can we embrace technologies, and how quickly can we create an ecosystem with these smaller companies with great technologies without acquiring them to make them work with us, so we as prime can provide certified systems into the battlefield. Because the battlefield will be connected, it will be hypersonic, it will be huge because there will be sensors everywhere, you can't hide, and there will be huge amount of information that have to be digested all the time to create the situation awareness picture. That needs new technology, and all of us are thinking about that, also as a consequence of what we've seen in Ukraine.
Great, thanks. Guillaume, what for you are the sort of the top takeaways from the way that the war is shaping up in Ukraine for the European defense industry and for Airbus?
Maybe the main takeaway I see is Ukraine is Ukraine. It's one conflict that is very specific, and we need to draw the lessons from that conflict. But we should not believe that this is the blueprint of conflicts for the future. And that's something that worries me a bit, that we start to see everything with the lens of Ukraine, because the next ones might be of a very different nature, a different place, and not necessarily having the same unique situation of not involving NATO, but still being in a country that is very close to Europe, and parties not willing to be at war, but still supporting the conflict, one side or the other one. And that's a very specific conflict. So let's recognize that specific nature and draw the lessons for when it comes to Ukraine. How should be Ukraine manage moving forward, but not thinking that that is the resume of everything that can happen in the future. That would be, in my view, a big mistake. So we need to continue to look at the broader spectrum of potential conflicts. That's actually calling for a lot of military capabilities. That's more complex. They will require systems that will be very powerful and very technologically driven, maybe also some more basic stuff, but it will be in the future a war of technologies. And we've been speaking about the F-35. The F-35 took decades to develop. It's been a very expensive development. It is an expensive system. Still, we have more countries in Europe that have acquired or committed to acquire the F-35 than the sum of countries having acquired the Eurofighter and the Rafale together. So even if this system is extremely expensive, still it is much required. So that's why we need to collaborate in Europe, because if we want to be able to develop similar capabilities, there's no single country in Europe that can do this alone.
Thank you very much. We've run to the end of our time. Guillaume Faury from Airbus, thank you very much for joining us. And Michael Johansen, thanks very much for being on stage with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Before we move to our next panel, I would like to give the audience a bit of an introduction to the people we have writing for us at Politico. And we have here the reporters who cover defense for us: Josh Posaner, Caleb Larson, Laura Kayali, Jacopo Baragazzi, and Stuart Lau. We've just got a couple of minutes. And so maybe I'd ask you, starting with Josh, what is the top takeaway in the month that since we've launched Defense Pro? What's the most interesting story that you've worked on for defense in that time?
Thanks. I stole your seat, so sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I don't mind hovering in the background, so that's fine.
I think our top takeaway is clearly that it's a lot more complicated than we thought. And there's a lot of work that the EU needs to do to figure out what kind of role as a defence actor it wants to be in the future. And that's our job, because we're in an interesting time. We've got a budget to agree. Is the audio working? I'm hearing it twice.
No, it's fine.
Everybody can hear me, okay?
Yeah.
Super. So we have to do a lot of reporting, I think, on what the next budget is going to look like. Also, you heard the CEOs there talk about the acronyms, the various funding programs for ammo that we all know about. There's clearly going to be more of those. So this is the time of transition. I think it's a really interesting time for us to dive in to this field.
Great. Laura, you've been in Paris. What's the top story that you've done in the last month for us on defense?
One of the most important stories in Paris right now is about the budget, because the government and MPs introduced a potential new way to fund the defense industry via people's savings, called the livret A. So that is aimed at kind of making up for the banks' reluctance to finance the defense industry. So now this needs to go to the Senate. So this is in the coming days. And there's a bit of a lobbying battle between the defense industry and the banks. And there's also NGOs who are starting to launch petitions, etc., for people to basically say that they don't want to finance the defense industry with their savings. So this, until the end of the year, is one of the most important things in Paris. And if it works, and that could be a model that could be emulated in other countries.
Great, thanks. Maybe you could pass the mic to Caleb. No, not right. Caleb, you're in Berlin for us. The German government a week ago put out a completely revamped defense strategy. What's the significance of that? What's going on there?
I'm probably preaching to the choir, but Germany now wants to be a country that's not only the backbone of European security, but they want to be war capable, not defense capable, but war capable. That's a massive change in Germany's military posture post-Cold War. If you had said this is what is coming out of the defense ministry. Even a few months ago, people probably wouldn't have believed that. But there's this new reality on the ground that Germany is really trying to put its money where its mouth is, so to speak, and really support the European security architecture. Their signaling is good. They've done kind of the right things and made initial moves in that space, but it remains a little bit unclear what their medium and long-term goals are. How do they hit 2% spending and maintain that, especially after this special funding pot is over? How do they create good conditions for this deployment in Lithuania? These are things that, well,
4,000 soldiers.
4,000 soldiers, the first permanent deployment of Bundeswehr soldiers, I think, in its history. So the messaging is there, the signaling is there. What that looks like going forward remains to be seen, and that's what I'll be covering.
Great, thanks very much. Jacopo, you're buried deep in EU policy. You've looked a lot at the EU spending, the role that it's playing, and the ammunition program. What's your take on what's happening in Brussels on defense?
First of all, let me say how happy I am to see this audience, because for people like me who have been covering and following defense for almost 10 years, to see that now there is a product, it's already a huge political indication of what's going on since the age of the global strategy in PESCO. The two things that this month happened from my point of view was that the scoops that I made in the last months on defense, that when I scooped them, I knew that were going to be very difficult stories for the EU to be implemented. The 1 million rounds, that was the first leg of the EPF money for Ukraine, and the 20 billions, the Ukraine facility envelope that Borrell presented at the Foreign Affairs Council in July. Both of them we knew when I was writing the stories that were going to be very difficult targets to be achieved, and this month pessimists have been proven right, and which is not something I like to say, but in this case, this is what happened, and so now following the rest of the developments on these two files.
Great, thanks very much. Stuart, you're covering NATO, and you're working on a story on the race for Secretary General. There's a couple of Baltic candidates. Maybe you could sort of bring us up to speed on what the reaction is in Western Europe and in the States to the Baltic candidates.
Absolutely. First of all, it's a great pleasure to meet so many of you here. Thank you for the support for this event. Obviously, you know, the race for the NATO top job is going to be a very interesting political story here for us. In Brussels, we have seen the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, the Latvian Foreign Minister and former Prime Minister Karinš, also very interested in the top job, alongside the outgoing Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, of course. And we'll probably see even one or two more candidates in the mix as we march towards Washington Summit. And alongside, you know, all the practical policy issues that also require a lot of political attention, be it the support for Ukraine, be it Western Balkans, be it even a slight focus on Indo-Pacific. So a lot of political questions that we'll be watching here in Brussels for sure.
Thanks very much. And Josh, you are also a space correspondent. You're doing space issues for us. What's the European space story?
Well, I think a lot of people in this room definitely have found over the last few years that space plays a bigger role in their working week. I think for those that's not the case, I'd bet them a lunch it will be very soon, because there's a lot of stuff happening, not least with what Guillaume was talking about buy local and efforts to get Ariane rocket launches going as soon as possible. So I think this is going to be a fast-growing area for our coverage, and there's much to cover on the Ariane rocket, the European Space Agency moving forward, that's for sure.
Great. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you for coming up on stage, and I'll leave the next panel in Josh's hands. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Okay, so my name's Josh Pisana, again from Politico. think you all know that maybe by now. We'd like to introduce our 4 guests for a panel debate now. First of all, Benedicta von Seer-Toss. She's Managing Director for Peace, Security and Defence at the European External Action Service. That's a pretty hectic job title these days. Then 3 ambassadors to NATO. We have Natalia Galabarenko, the ambassador of Ukraine to NATO, David Quarry, the ambassador of the United Kingdom to NATO, and Tomasz Szatkowski, the ambassador of Poland to NATO. If I could welcome them on stage at their convenience. Hi. Is there an order to the seats, or can you just sit where you'd like to, Benedicta, please? Finn invited. Hi, everybody. Hi, David.
Hi, Josh. How are you?
How are you doing? Thanks for joining. Having a technical malfunction here on my back. So,
Okay.
Hi, Benedict.
do we have one more NATO ambassador in the building? Here we go. Maybe I should take a hand mic if this is not working so well. Everybody can hear me? It's good. My boss says it's good. That's great. Okay, thank you everybody for participating today. We've got a hard stop at 6, so that gives us 35 minutes to get through a lot of questions on a lot of different topics. So can I start with you, Ambassador Galabarenko? The NATO-Ukraine Council. This is a serious topic these days. This was decided around Vilnius. It's aimed at including Ukraine in discussions as a peer, not as an applicant, not as a country asking for arms, but as a peer. Let me ask you directly, do you feel like a peer in these meetings? Do you think enough is being done to make Ukraine feel welcome within the alliance?
Though even today we had the very first experience of how does it feel sitting at one table and drafting the document together with our allies. So before, it was like, the principle, take it or leave it. So if even together we were having a meeting in the past and the draft statement was elaborated, it was always like NATO position. And it was only Ukrainian job just to accept it. What can I say? This is a new, so to say, culture of dealing together. We are sitting as equals, not like before it was 30+1, but now it's like 32 together. And what can I say? It's a hard job, frankly speaking, because you have very experienced colleagues on the other side of the table, and you are to defend your own interests. But in the end, I believe that for us is some kind of also a test for Ukraine to behave in this new political culture, to show that we can be very valuable partner, that even if we argue about things, we can come to certain consensus and we can be really adding to each other. It's only the beginning, as I mentioned, because we just together approved the creation of the council, the substructure, the working plan, and we only started holding the joint meetings. So in 1 week it would be the very first meeting at the level of foreign ministers, and that's why we were drafting today the statement together. And so we will be welcoming Dmytro Kuleba in this new format.
So far so good, but much work to do. Is that a fair summary? So, David, just to switch over to you, I know that the UK is a very big supporter of Ukraine inside NATO. You'll be welcoming back a familiar face to many people over the next few days as we look at the Foreign Ministers Summit next week. Can you talk a little bit about the work going on to support and include Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I agree with Natalia, with Ambassador Galabarenko. This is a very significant step forward. It is not just a bureaucratic change that we now have this NATO-Ukraine Council. It is bringing Ukraine tangibly closer to NATO, and we're having a different quality of discussion, I think, already that we've seen. We've done it at head of government level, we've done it at defence minister level already, and we're now doing it at foreign minister level as well. We've talked about energy security, we've talked about food security, so there's a lot that's happening there. The other sort of big outcomes from the Vilnius summit were a significant increase in the size of the comprehensive assistance package, which is $500 million, and there's a lot of work to make that happen now. A lot of that will support Ukraine's increasing interoperability with NATO. It will provide practical support for Ukraine as it prepares for the winter. It'll help this process of bringing Ukraine practically ever closer to NATO as well. There was also an important decision about shortening the membership path for Ukraine at Vilnius by removing the need for the membership action plan. Plus, we've got agreement now on reforms that NATO is encouraging and that Ukraine will be leading, and ministers will discuss that next week. So in all of this, I think you can see substantial delivery already from Vilnius in July about both NATO making a practical difference in supporting our close partner, Ukraine, but also politically bringing Ukraine ever closer to the alliance. And that's the trajectory that we want to see.
Great, and it might not feel like it just yet outside because it's a bit warmer than usual at this time of year, but we are already in winter. How much work can happen before the end of the year, and what do you expect will happen next week at the Foreign Minister meeting? Is that just a stock take?
Well, it's the first foreign ministerial in the cycle of 3 that is preparing for the Washington summit. So I think some of the focus will be on how will we making the new NATO-Ukraine Council work? Is it delivering for both NATO and Ukraine? I think the answer will be yes. Are we making this new comprehensive assistance package? Is that delivering practical effect for Ukraine? I think the answer is yes. But people will also, ministers will of course want to talk about the trajectory of the conflict over the winter. We are seeing the Ukrainians continue to fight with incredible bravery and resilience. We know that the Russians will come after Ukraine's critical national infrastructure again this winter, trying to hit energy supply, deliberately targeting civilians. So I'm sure ministers will want to talk about how we are providing support there. So it'll be a mix of the kind of high politics, I think, looking ahead to Washington, but also the practical support along the way.
I'm really keen. We've been writing about the EU context a lot in terms of support to Ukraine, but just to Ambassador Szatkowski, before we do that, in terms of what's happening with Polish support at the moment, there's obviously been a change of government recently. That means potentially a change of NATO policy, procurement policy, a lot of things pertinent to the defence debate. What can you tell us about conversations that will happen next week, given the political transition, and the future of Poland's support for Ukraine?
Well, I don't think that's going to change. The support to Ukraine and the has been one of the issues that has actually been unifying the Polish political culture across recent years. So I mean, there may be changes in accents when it comes to that, but I think the general codes will be continued. Poland will remain the main hub for support of the Ukraine. It's a daily job of hundreds of people on the ground, both military and civilians, who actually enable all the support that flows through Poland to Ukraine, also that create conditions for training of Ukrainian troops. That a large part of that effort takes place in Poland and under the partly also under the leadership of Polish officers. So I don't expect any major change in that.
And you're certain that I've been to Rzeszów and the areas along the border, which is obviously a core conduit for people going in and out of the country and arms, and you're confident that support will remain steadfast and that conduit will remain intact.
This is the view of the Polish public, and in the electoral campaign leading up to elections, this issue wasn't debated in terms of principles. Maybe there have been nuances as to how we should communicate with Ukraine and but the main principles have not been debated, so or questioned. I mean they were debated, but they were not questioned. So I don't expect absolutely. There was some. You might be referring to some friction that was connected to the. I mean there was. I mean there was a misunderstanding. I mean, basically and honestly, I'm sorry to say that here, but the media didn't do a good job because somebody took the words of the Prime Minister out of the context, where he in an interview where he precisely said that Poland will continue operating the hub for Ukraine. and there never was an intent to stop support to Ukraine and the role that Poland plays in this operation.
We always stand ready to stand corrected at Politico, but there was definitely, this was a fierce topic of debate during the election campaign. Would you concede that that was the case?
You know, I mean, there were other issues that, I mean, we have issues that we don't combine with the strategic issues as support to Ukraine. The whole aspect of the EU accession, which, by the way, Poland supports and Poland very much initiated with support of other European member states. But there never has been an intent to stop, like I have said, and the words of the Prime Minister have been taken out of. In the same interview, he said Poland will continue operating the hub. Poland will. We cannot stop the support to Ukraine because Ukraine is fighting its just war in defense against Russian aggression. So. This is
couldn't be clearer than that.
Couldn't be clearer than that. Yeah.
Benedicta, I know this is difficult because I'm going to hold you responsible for promises that were made by a lot of people a very long time ago, out of your remit, but you stand here to defend that. How can we really think about support for Ukraine if basic promises are not kept? And I'm talking here about the 1 million ammo target for middle of March next year. It's clear, according to numbers we have access to, that the EU is nowhere near meeting that target, and it's over halfway there. So isn't this a problem with credibility overall?
I think what is very important is to see what has been done. I think there's a long time until March. I will come to that. But first of all, I think it's very important to understand what the EU has done, where we have come from, and where we are moving towards. So the target is very important. We saw there's a problem. Ukraine urgently needs ammunition, so we put in place a completely new structure. We, of course, use the European Peace Facility, our fund, with which we have now supported donations worth about 17 billion euros. And we have developed what we call a three-track approach. So we have incentivized member states to provide more ammunition from existing stocks. We have, within 5 weeks, done framework contracts for joint procurement under the EDA. And this is something we have never done before. So we have placed orders. We know it's not enough placing orders. The industry also needs to produce it. So we have introduced this third part to complete the cycle, which is looking at production. So we looked at how can we ensure that industry can ramp up production, how can we ensure that we address bottlenecks, for example, what regulations do we need, so that it has been really unprecedented in the kind of support, in the speed of the support, and also looking at the whole cycle. Now, where do we stand with the goal? It's true we have by now fulfilled about a third, which is all under the, what I call track 1, so the existing stocks. We know of quite significant orders that were placed under the second track, also with the framework contracts, because we combined procurement by the EU with national framework contracts. And we see that there's a lot coming. Commissioner Breton, for example, he said that by March 2024, European industry will be capable of producing 1 million rounds of ammunition per year. So the question will be, will we manage to meet the target by 2024? It's a very ambitious target. We always knew that. And maybe we won't achieve it in March, but I'm quite certain we will achieve it next year. And I think we also, need to look beyond the sheer number in 24. We need to look at the whole process that we have set in motion to get there. It's a real shift of instruments. It's a mind shift. It's changing the defense industry. And I think it's recognizing that that all the different things we have to put in place to be war capable. I think it was said in the last panel, the expression that the German defense minister used. I think that we know that our industry needs to be capable to provide what we need, both for Ukraine and for ourselves, and that's the whole change we have put in motion.
Understood. I just want to stay on this point briefly, but first of all, to remind our audience, both in the room and those folks watching on the live stream, that you can, of course, put questions on the Slido device, and that moves through the internet directly to the device in front of me now. In order to get your question there, it has to be through the hashtag Politico Pro Defense. So I'll start taking a few questions in a minute. In the meantime, Benedicta, would you concede that maybe it was a bad idea for the EU to set the million target in the first place?
Not at all. I think it's very good to set ambitious targets because these force us to really move quickly. They move us to make fundamental changes. And that's exactly what we have done. And even I think that's a great value, even if we didn't manage to arrive at the target at the end of March, but a little bit later. I think, the whole change we have now, as I said, set in motion is really worth the effort because it's on ammunition, but it also goes, of course, much beyond it.
David, really interested in this topic of how the industry starts to ramp up and also how you start to do that beyond the framework of just looking at the EU because, of course, the UK is not in the EU anymore, but it is in NATO. Norway is obviously a very close partner on a lot of EU defence projects too. Are you seeing adequate contracts coming through for industry to ramp up to meet the demands of NATO?
So this is absolutely one of the highest priority areas that we are working on at the moment. It was clear from more than a year ago that we needed urgent action to increase our collective defence industrial capability. It was one of the biggest, most important themes at the Vilnius summit in the summer. We now have this thing, the Defence Production Action Plan, that our leaders agreed at Vilnius. And turning that into reality is one of the things that we are spending most time and energy focusing on right now. We've all got a big challenge, both to give Ukraine the equipment that it needs and also to resupply ourselves. We're all going to have to do more on this. And to do that, we are going to need the strongest possible transatlantic defence industrial base. Now, we're going to need to do that in partnership in different ways. For us, NATO will have primacy in this work, primacy in setting the standards, primacy in being clear about the demand signal, primacy in terms of being a platform for multi-year, multi-state contracts, and also doing a lot of work on how we can break down barriers to industrial cooperation. If you look at the British defence industry, our two biggest capability developments at the moment, GCAP, combat air, we do with Italy and Japan. AUKUS, the nuclear-powered submarines we are doing with the US and Australia. That's the nature of our defence industries. They're all multinational in this. So we welcome EU efforts to increase defence industrial capability. It's a team sport. We've all got to make a contribution to this. But the important thing is that it's not done in a way which puts up barriers to that kind of international collaboration that is so key to making progress on this.
We are seeing a little bit of a recalibration inside Europe generally, though, right? And who produces what? Because as Jan said in the previous panel, Ambassador Szytkowski, Poland is now, I think, the largest spender in terms of percentage of GDP. Are we seeing a realignment towards Poland as being a kind of armory of the EU now in weapons production?
You're asking, is Poland becoming could you?
Yeah, are we seeing a recalibration?
Okay.
Poland's becoming a larger state.
Well, I mean, certainly, our ambition is to be one of the major players in that context. I don't think we can be the leading player, but certainly we can be one of the larger players, and hopefully it will also open up some chances in the future to cooperate in major projects in the transatlantic industrial sort of arena as much as in the EU arena. So far, it wasn't sufficiently successful. Let me put it this way. But we've opened up some. We've initiated some very interesting partnerships, also including the UK, with Korea. We've also doing a lot with some of the US companies on the Polish soil, as well as with the European companies when it comes to the aerospace dimension.
A lot of deals getting signed these days.
I'm sorry?
A lot of deals and moves being signed these days. Is not
Yes,
coming out
yes,
of
yes, yes. For instance, when it comes to helicopters, when it comes to armor production, rocket artillery, when it comes to rocket artillery and all sides of kinds of missiles, I think you will see certainly a very significant increase. I think manpads, when it comes to manpads, I think we are becoming certainly one of the leading manpad producers in the world. With also the US forces selecting Polish manpads for their inventory. So, well, absolutely. I mean, you will see a shift in the future. We are making sure that this huge effort will benefit in a way that also Polish defense industry will be more robust, but it will be connected with the industries of partners and allies, so that we can jointly tackle such endeavors in the future.
Ambassador Galabarenko, your officials from Kiev have been on a tour of major Western countries talking about trying to persuade Western arms manufacturers to invest in local production inside Ukraine, talking about a business case that will far outstrip this conflict, assuming it ends soon. We hope so. How much of your role now is based around trying to talk about Ukraine as an attractive destination for weapons manufacturing?
From the very beginning, it was obvious that, you cannot always, and especially in the long term, because the war is now coming in already the second year. So it was obvious for us that we should somehow also manage our own production, at least of some, or even like Soviet even calibers of rounds of ammunition, and even 155. But the problem was and still is that the majority of the territory is under the permanent attacks of the Russian drones and Iskanders and all other types of. So we are trying, to secure also the production and to speed up everything and to produce something that we can. And also, if, for example, together with Western partners, we are trying also to relaunch the production of Western types of ammunition on our territory. But again, there is a very challenging problem. It's the constant, permanent attacks by the Russian Federation on our territory. So everything that's why it's becoming a very big problem. So far, for example, when we are talking about repair of the tanks, for example, and other weapon which was injured during the battlefield, we are using, of course, the capabilities of our neighboring countries, for example, Poland. Yes, it adds up to logistical problems, to cover the distance from battlefield to Poland and then to get for example, the Leo tanks repaired and then moving back to the battlefield to Ukraine. It requires time, money, and resources of many people. But I'm afraid some kind of a service can only be relocated now in the neighboring countries of Ukraine.
Understood. We're getting a lot of questions on the EU context here in terms of the financial resources that can be mobilized in the future. We have the European Peace Facility now. That isn't named specifically in the questions here, but I guess this is what everybody's talking about right now. There was talk of a 20 billion fund over the next 4 years. That hasn't been agreed yet. Now we're looking at an annual piecemeal approach. Benedicte, are we close to some kind of system? Diplomats have told us they would like to see a system in place before cash is committed. Are we close to a framework for how future financial assistance will be dispersed?
If your question is, will we have predictability?
Yep.
That is what we are talking about. You know that the negotiations are happening in the context of the multi-annual financial framework, which is by nature until 2027. So it's a multi-annual plan. And what we need to do, the EPF proved very useful and effective. So we need to see how can we carry it over into next years. We will make the decision at the same time as we make the decisions on the MFF. We need to look at what support is needed within Ukraine. We know that there will have to be a shift from destocking to more procurement because simply stocks are running lower and lower. And we see that within the Rammstein format, the UDCG, that we are more looking towards long-term force planning for Ukraine. And of course, this is what we use also as a baseline for our EU contribution or the contribution of EU member states. And then we see how can we support this, for example, with a EPF, we will look at. So we need to look at the modalities, and then of course we need to talk about the money. There's a proposal out there, and also this is part, I would say, one element of three very important elements, because we don't simply look at military support until 27. We look at what we call the Ukraine facility, so it's the reconstruction, economic, humanitarian support, which is another package that is being discussed. And we, of course, look at enlargement as well, and these three together will be a very important support package for Ukraine.
And this will get picked up seriously again, I understand, at the UCO summit in the middle of December. Is your sense that there's a frustration that some countries have been ordering weaponry from outside the EU, and that effectively a lot of the bigger countries are saying, look, if we're going to create this fund to support Ukraine, we'd like weaponry orders to go back to European industrial players?
I think every member state is free to order where they want to order. I think that's very important, and we have to see where, in which layer do we co-finance, for example, or incentivize with EU money. It's not we don't want to tell member states what to do, but we of course want to incentivize, or we will only pay where we can justify it when it comes to procurement. And here, using European defense industry, of course, is an important aspect.
I do. Before we take the helicopter back up and look at things in a more macro political perspective, I just want to focus in on this issue of how NATO and the EU interface a little bit. I think especially their standardization is a key issue at the moment.
Love that question.
Yeah, everybody.
No, really, I do. Please give it to me.
We sadly only have 15 minutes, but let's get into it. Specifically on the European Defence Fund and the joint procurement, we have this absurd situation now where the orders that have taken place are for 155 caliber munitions, which go in 4 key weapon systems. So even when you talk about 155 caliber munitions, now you're not talking about the same thing for everybody. This makes it very, very difficult to organize a joint response, for example, to helping Ukraine. I'll come back to you, Benedicta, but David, I think you're really into this topic too. Do you feel that there's enough work going on at the moment? You were clear a second ago, NATO should be on the lead.
Yeah, I mean, a huge amount of work is underway, and we're all learning the lessons of the conflict as we go through it, and one of which is about the proliferation of systems, even within our own national systems. It's not just between different, amongst different allies, it's within our national systems. And it's often not the case that the problem is that there are no standards, is that we are all not observing those standards. So, NATO sets the framework. We've got to make sure that we are disciplined within each of our systems, that we are not always designing the exquisitely perfect system for one particular outcome, but that we are doing things which are as interoperable and interchangeable as possible, and that we are abiding by those standards, because it's no good us all having the standards if we are not then abiding by those and making those the drivers of what we actually do in practice. Are we doing enough? If that's the question, probably not. Are we trying really hard at it? Yes, we are.
And is Benedicta spending enough time at NATO headquarters talking over these issues and vice versa?
Well, I think there is a big EU-NATO conversation to be had about all of this, because, as I said earlier, the need is so great that part of the answer has to be more effective EU-NATO coordination on this. We have a view about the primacy of NATO's role in certain areas of that, but it is very clear that we all need to do more, and we need to do it together, pointing in the same direction rather than pulling in different directions.
I think you probably know where I'm going with this now, but are you happy with what David is saying about NATO being in the lead?
I think we need to take a step back and look at what is the problem that we actually have. What are the lessons? I totally agree with David. We have seen that we don't have enough capabilities in Europe, neither to provide enough equipment to Ukraine, nor to defend ourselves. You just need to look at the discussions that are taking place at NATO on readiness goals and capability targets. And we also see that the systems that we have don't speak enough with each other. So there's a problem of interoperability. I don't think that's necessarily first and foremost a NATO problem or an EU problem. It's a problem of European security and transatlantic security. So what we need to do now is to use every organization and to throw as many solutions at this problem as we have. And of course, it has to happen in a very organized and coordinated way. the EU does not have the ambition to set the standards. It's NATO. Of course, we use NATO standards. We have that already enshrined in our documents. Look at the PESCO document, for example. We use NATO standards, but the problem is not that we don't have these standards, but as David says, they're not being applied, or industry is doing a standard plus, and then we end up with a situation like take the Dutch and German howitzer, that there's probably no more integrated forces than the Dutch and the German ones, but still their howitzers use different kinds of ammunition. So what I think what the EU can really bring here is the regulatory power. We are very good at standardization. We are very good at we have the convening power. We can look at supply chains, etc., etc. We have the funding. I think military mobility is a very good example where we use NATO standards and NATO requirements to then pay for something that changes infrastructure within Europe that can be used both by the EU and by NATO, or EU members and NATO allies, of which we have 22, hopefully 23 soon of the same. So I'm very much for being pragmatic here. I think we all together have a huge problem. We shouldn't create a competition amongst ourselves. We should know very well where the real competitors are. I think they are outside the transatlantic area. So I would say let's use the strength of every organization to achieve what we need, which is more and more interoperable, interchangeable capabilities in Europe.
Ambassador Galabarenko, if I could take this to you and see how much of a frustration is this lack of standardization.
My comment will be quite short, but I think the audience will understand how we in Ukraine require this better coordination and standardization. Because can you imagine that our armed forces in Ukraine are now operating more than 200 different systems of weapons? And, it came as a surprise to many at the beginning when we realized, we are our soldiers at the battlefield, that 155 is not always, the same 155 from different countries of NATO. So this is about also standardization when you are receiving certain, let's imagine, system or launchers, and you can use specifically missiles which are produced for this system in country A or B. So you cannot, use another or replace. In fact, we were supposing it would be a unified system, but this is not. This is just only one practical confirmation that it should be better coordination, it should be better unification, so to say, standardization of different things that we are doing and we are operating. And we are getting this also feedback to our partners, saying to them that, look, this operates, in that sense. So these are the drawbacks, these are the mistakes, these are the positive sides, these are the weak places that should be also repaired. So, and in fact, actually, the reasoning behind the creation, for example, of the contact group, so-called Rammstein, that was actually that main reason, to try to coordinate everything that is going to Ukraine, so that we would be like helping each other. We will be not, duplicating each other, and we will be escaping the situation when we are receiving certain system, and then, after 2 or 3 months, we realize that there are no spare parts, no munition anymore, and then, the system is becoming useless, and you are to wait actually when the country A will reproduce something for you. So this is, so to say, the practical side of what we were discussing.
And Ambassador Satkovsky, this is obviously a very key issue for you, because not only is Poland a big arms producer, but it's also, if you like, the clearing warehouse through which much of the arms to Ukraine do go. Can you talk a little bit about the standardization debate and how important you think this issue is?
Well, absolutely. I think we have to recognize that we have failed within the alliance over years. This is a never-ending story, and I agree with previous speakers that this is primarily up to the alliance. But indeed, standards were created over years, over decades, and they've been ignored or neglected for reasons of certain particularisms. Some actors wanted to create unique systems than to take full advantage of the maintenance and be able to basically reap off the clients. The problem is, what could be the solution? Of course, one side is the cooperation with the EU, where EU could indeed incentivize standardization through its financial mechanism, at least for the group of countries that happen to be both the EU and NATO members. But I think we ought to do more in the alliance. And one of the aspects is, I think, the greater politicization of the issue. So basically, we should give it more prominence in our debate and create some metrics and basically see, who is failing. And then bring the issue also to the attention of the politicians, because many of them are not even aware that their industrial complexes or their defense departments are allowing such as departures from standards. And we are doing what we can in Poland. At least I can say that to extend the artillery systems that we produce are we are making an effort so that they can operate with as many ammunition systems as it's possible. It's not always the case, because there is also proprietary aspects and the intellectual protection rights. And by the way, we also should have this discussion because this was hampering certain efforts within a coalition over certain capabilities supporting Ukraine.
Understood. Benedicta, I see we're getting some questions on the Slido platform about the access to finances for private and small arms producers. I know that that's a serious issue for the industry at large. What work is the EU doing maybe to make the European Investment Bank, for example, accessible to smaller defense contractors?
That's something that is being discussed in the Commission. You know that the HRVP, together with Commissioner Borrell, met with representatives from industry to understand what are their needs, how can we help, and this was one of the important topics that they addressed. It's a very complex issue, as you can imagine. It's something, as I said, that will be discussed, and so far there's no final outcome yet, but we certainly understand that that's, if we want industry to ramp up, we also need to make sure that they have access to finance.
And it's a direction of travel that the EU generally is moving toward, whether that be legislation, whether that be further efforts to open up markets. You don't think that the defense industry should be taboo to investors, effectively, because of ESG standards?
Because of?
ESG standards, which is often cited as the reason.
As I said, it's a very complex debate, and it's something that is happening in the Commission, and we know that we need to ensure that our industry is equipped in a way that they can actually provide what we need. So it's part of the broader effort. Next year, at the beginning of next year, we will have the defense industrial strategy coming out, which will be very important, which will address lots of different aspects of the, I would say, whole industrial cycle. And I'm sure there will be more conversations in that context as well.
Can you tell us what's in the strategy paper?
I can, but I won't.
All right, not yet. So that's our job for the next weeks then, to get into that. I want to now close on the politics a little bit, and I think, Benedicta, you get a free pass on some of the questions now that are quite easy for the NATO ambassadors to address. First and foremost, just for you, David, the issue of David Cameron returning to the stage. We mentioned that very briefly at the beginning. Do you think that has an extra significance given his standing here as a leader previously in the whole Brexit debate?
Well, he's off to a great start as Foreign Secretary. He was in Ukraine last week. He deliberately went there, I think, on his first or second full day in office. He's passionately committed to us continuing to play the leading role that we've played on Ukraine. I think he'll be elsewhere this week, then he'll be with us next week. He's obviously determined, and I'm very glad that he is, to maintain our extraordinary support to Ukraine. He's a massive fan of NATO. He chaired the Wales 2014 summit, which was obviously one of the landmark summits where we agreed 2% as a target for defence spending. That was in the context of Russia's first illegal invasion of Ukraine, and he brings that passion with him to the job now, I'm sure, and we'll hear more of that next week. But can I just say,
sure,
hogging the microphone for a moment, I think this ESG point about investment is really important, and I think it's going to become a much bigger issue. We've seen it at NATO that some tech companies who were previously hesitant to engage with defence, there's been a sea change with some of them since Ukraine, because they've seen the moral purpose of what they're doing. I don't think ESG guidance has yet caught up with that for investment. And I think that is a big issue that we are not talking about enough at the moment.
I promise you we will continue to talk about that at Politico, because I think this is an emerging theme that's very important to the industry. 3 questions. I'm going to put them to the 3 ambassadors, which I think some form of answer would be very kindly received. Benedicta, you get a pass. I think it's fair to offer you that on this instance. First of all, maybe to start with Poland, then Ukraine, then UK, then Benedicta. Can we just be clear now, Mark Rutte is going to be the next Secretary General of NATO? Poland.
Well, I think he's certainly a heavyweight. He's a very good candidate. We're in a very particular situation. We are in a post-election period, so we are waiting for a new government to pass the veto of confidence, and this will be the matter for the government that will pass the measure of confidence to decide.
Ukraine.
No, I can only express, so to say, my personal view as far as we are not within the alliance. So, for me, every new Secretary General who will be defending the interests of Ukraine, who will be mobilizing the alliance help for us, this is the best choice. So whether it would be the Michael Rutte or whether it would be somebody else, so we are not sticking to this, so to say, country approach. However, I do believe that maybe at some point it's also right time for the alliance to look at the region of Eastern Europe. So my preference, again, personal, would be at some point to see somebody, Secretary General, representing the Eastern Europe. So maybe even somebody from their neighboring countries with Ukraine.
Kaja Kallas, for example?
Why not?
Why not, indeed. David Cameron actually was once touted as a NATO Sec-Gen. Mark Rutte, would that be okay for the Brits?
Well, look, we've got a brilliant Secretary General now. He's going to be Secretary General until next October. I'm sure we will have a brilliant Secretary General to succeed him. There are some names out there at the moment. Some of them are very heavyweight names, as Tomasz has mentioned, who I'm sure will do the job brilliantly. But there's a process that will continue for a while yet before I think it surfaces more publicly.
And Benedicta, getting it back in the hands of an ex-EU leader soon?
If you ask the EU, then the EU would, of course, be happy to see someone from the EU, but I'm sure that NATO will make a very wise choice.
Okay. On to the next question. Over to the end to Poland. What would a Trump presidency, him coming back in the US, mean for the NATO defense alliance?
Well, I mean, of course, we in the alliance we are trying not to comment on internal politics of allies, and I think, of course, there. I mean, but let me just say, we have to look at rhetorics, and sometimes rhetorics may be worrying, but we also have to look for. But we also have to look for acts, and in terms of the previous presidency of Donald Trump, we saw many different. I mean, there were, questionable rhetorics sometimes coming from different officials, and I will not name them, but also important steps ahead. The spending within the alliance increased, and I hope have been continued to increase, and also has the presence of U.S. troops in Europe. So sometimes the actual developments are not as worrisome as the rhetorics that might accompany them.
Understood. Ukraine, Trump too.
Our job now is to work both, actually, with Democrats and Republicans. And I think for everybody here, it's obvious why. So there's still a pending question of the financial help to Ukraine. So our job is to work closely with Congress and then to push also for the financial and military support to Ukraine, because we do understand that it would be a complicated winter ahead of us. And then the spring will come, and there should be again, new strategy elaborated how we will be proceeding with this war in Russia in the view of our victory. And as to the Trump I'll leave it to American people to decide. We were quite happy with current cooperation with the present government and President Biden, so we can only applaud for everything what they have so far done for Ukraine.
David?
Well, I'm not going to get into US politics, but US leadership within the alliance for wider Euro-Atlantic security is indispensable. We hope and expect that it will continue. But we must make sure that we, Europe, are doing our bit in all of this. We should be more focused on what we can do and where we need to raise our game, rather than, I think, worrying too much about what's going on in US politics. So that means defense investment, it means defense industrial, it means our support to Ukraine, but let's do our own homework first.
Benedicta?
It's like David took my speaking points. It's very important that we look at what we do in Europe. It's about doing our share, fulfilling our responsibility for our own security, for transatlantic security, all the different aspects or elements we have to look at, and the aspect of burden sharing when it comes to wider security is very important, and we need to be equipped for that.
Okay, and the final question, brief answers from all four of you. David, as you mentioned earlier, we're on that process between Vilnius in July and Washington, D.C. next July. That's already ongoing. It's a long way away until next summer, but we can already get some signs of what might be on the way. What would you say the three priorities are? What things could we look forward to hearing about more, talking about more, fixing in treaties and regulations and papers ahead of next summer? Poland.
Continuing support. Oh, sorry, did you?
If you're very enthusiastic about it.
Go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, well, filling our plants with forces. I think we are on a way to for that. It's going to be, that requires still some work, but we are on the right track. Second, making sure that we spend more and invest in our defense. Third, Ukraine, of course, support to Ukraine and making sure that Ukraine gets closer to the alliance, and we are able to support Ukraine.
Ukraine?
For us, number one is, of course, still Washington to deliver everything on what we agreed in Vilnius. And I think it's quite logical approach. When you are asking for more, you should show that you have delivered on everything that was agreed in Vilnius. So I think we are doing quite good. We established the council. We started its practical implementation. It would be annual national program already in the pipeline, all the reforms. And just to remind everybody here that in Vilnius communique, it was a very important political message for Ukraine, that the invitation will be extended when it would be a political consensus and when conditions will be met. Conditions, we understand, of course, security part, and another part is reforms. So that's why I mentioned that we will be implementing a new national program. And of course, building up this political consensus among other allies to build up support for our future membership.
Great Britain.
Four things. First of all, continuing deterrence and defence, including through the defence investment pledge, making that real, getting everybody to 2%, and also making this defence production action plan real. Secondly, continuing support to Ukraine, bringing them ever closer to the alliance and giving them the practical support. Thirdly, continuing the wider transformation of the alliance to meet the new global challenges to our Euro-Atlantic security area. Sorry, to meet the new sort of challenges to security in the Euro-Atlantic area. And then fourthly, deepening our global partnerships.
Understood. I know we have a very eerily blinking red clock in front of us now that's told us we're out of time. But Benedicta, can I get a word from you?
I think it will be very important to go another step forward in EU and NATO cooperation. You asked earlier, is David seeing Benedicta often enough in the HQ? I can say we have many meetings on a daily basis with NATO, so there's a lot of exchange going on, but I think it's also good every once in a while to have a more formalized step forward, like we had, for example, with the past joint declarations. So I think if we manage to flag this need for ever closer cooperation also in the summit, that would be good.
And certainly you mentioned military mobility. That's a major topic as well. I was hoping somebody might bring that up again, but we've been looking into it the last days. I know that's a big topic of debate at the moment. Guys, thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to my editor, Jan Chensky, now, but join me in thanking our guests for joining us. Benedicta. Thank you. David, thanks a lot. Oh, sorry. Hey, thanks.
Very much. Thanks very much to all the panelists for taking part, and to Josh for running a really good panel. I think there's a reason that senior officials are called diplomats, because you could certainly see their diplomatic skills when faced with the question of how to respond to a second Trump presidency, of dancing around that question without potentially offending any Americans in the audience. I'd like to thank all our panelists on both panels for a fascinating discussion. I think that the message that really came through from both of them was the real need for a clear political direction from capitals, from the EU, and from NATO to set the terms for the ongoing defense transformation, and to ensure that industry and countries are pulling in the same direction, with the overarching goal of ensuring that Ukraine has the ability to win the war that Russia unleashed on them over a year ago. I think also we heard lurking in the background the need to balance the need of maintaining Europe's industrial capacity with the pressure felt in many countries to buy off-the-shelf equipment, especially from the States. I was struck by Mikael Johansson's comment that the current picture of about 70% of equipment coming from the States and 30% coming from Europe should be flipped around for the better future of the EU. And I think on the panel that Josh was running, it was really striking to see the unity among the EU and NATO members on the long-term commitment to support Ukraine. I'd like to take a quick look at the results of the poll presented by ASD. If you remember, the question was, what do you consider the top priority for adapting the European defense industry to the new security environment? And so the winner is strengthen innovation capacity to develop the next generation of defense technologies, which I think our two CEOs underlined in their panel. The second is enhance production capacity to deliver faster and larger quantities of defense equipment. And number three is reduce dependencies for critical raw materials, components, and technologies. There's an issue of China lurking in the background. Hopefully, on our next event, we might be able to tackle that. I'd like to thank you, the audience, both here and online, for taking part in today's event. To our speakers for joining us on stage and remotely, the Politico Live team for putting this whole event together, and finally to our partner ASD for making this event possible. We'd love to hear your feedback, so please do email us about the event, and the address is live@politico.eu. And finally, check our Politico Events website for the latest lineup on events happening this year, and the address is https://www.politico.eu/events. And I'm hoping that when you look there, you will see more defense events coming up. Thanks again for being with us today.